This is Russia, the biggest nation on the planet, and the main aggressor in what could turn out to be the most significant war of this era. From the outset, I wish to emphasize that I, like nearly every online strategist on social media, and completely unqualified to discuss the specifics of the current assault on Ukraine, yet this is a war that more than any that preceded it is being waged just as fiercely with finances as it is with armor and warplanes. And from that perspective, we can understand a lot about a nation that by many measures is genuinely frightening, but by many others is something different. Altogether, as all of us have been endlessly scrolling the latest reports of the events inside Ukraine, there is a phrase that we have been told again and again repeatedly, which is that although Russia's enormous landmass, abundant natural resources, and huge population exist, its economy is relatively quite weak. Its national production has been likened in scale to states such as Texas and Florida, which is arguably somewhat misleading if for no other reason than the economy of Texas is enormous. Yet it also conveys the wrong impression because the economy of Texas is by nearly every standard stronger than Russia's. It's odd to label the 11th biggest economy on Earth insufficient, but it's not the headline statistics that reveal the full picture, so much as the wasted potential had certain choices been made differently during the past 3 decades. There is no reason to assume that Russia couldn't rank among the richest, most flourishing countries in the world. Right now, this was a nation that in fewer than 10 years expanded its production by more than 800%. It had citizens who were eager to adopt capitalism and work relentlessly to create a brighter future for themselves, and it had an international community that mostly wanted it to succeed to prevent slipping back into another Cold War. So what went wrong? Just how big and strong is Russia's economy today? What halted the expansion it was undergoing in the early 2000s? And ultimately, is it in a condition where it can rationalize a war as expensive as the one it has now entered? As always, after we've covered all of that, we can place Russia on the Economics Explained Global Ranking Board. Yeah, this is going to be yet another nation I probably won't be welcome in for some time once more. Okay, so the economy of Russia, as we understand it today, began at the conclusion of 1991, after the Soviet Union was formally disbanded and the Russian Federation emerged from its remains together with Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Estonia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Ukraine. The world's second most influential power at the moment vanishing, essentially in a single night, created a major and dangerous political vacuum after enduring a failed coup effort in 1989. Mikhail Gorbachev, the final leader of the USSR, wasn't particularly interested in remaining visible as a public personality longer than absolutely necessary. That left Boris Yeltsin, a one-time senior Soviet official, as the sole head of the new Russian Federation, while Western nations were delighted that the Soviet Union, their longtime rival for nearly 50 years, had finally collapsed. They were in some respects even more fearful of Russia during this period than they had been in prior decades. This marked the single greatest transformation of power in global history. Even setting aside the humanitarian disaster of millions of citizens uncertain where they could find jobs or how to obtain food or what their new state was meant to function as the rest of the world was grappling with a potentially bigger concern, which was that this delicate nation possessed an arsenal of thousands of nuclear devices, and it could very easily slide backward into another communist enemy. Yeltsin was, after all, a previous Soviet statesman, so there wasn't any solid reason to assume that he couldn't simply steer the nation back into a Soviet style of leadership. Recognizing this emerging danger and hoping to stabilize the circumstances as thoroughly as possible, a strategy was established drawing on a manual issued by the International Monetary Fund and various other world financial organizations. Here's a thought for you. Imagine you have a country that's an utter disaster. The government has collapsed, the currency has disappeared. Citizens are unsure who owns anything. Practically everything is starting from nothing. What can be done well? Fortunately, some very intelligent economists figured out exactly how to proceed, which is why we had what became known as the Washington Consensus, so labeled because it was designed by the kinds of agencies that keep their headquarters in Washington, D.C., the Washington Consensus essentially acts as the IKEA assembly guide you consult when you're attempting to construct an entire economy out of nothing but ready-to-assemble parts. And it contains 10 core directions. Fiscal policy control with avoidance of massive budgetary imbalances relative to GDP redirection of government expenditure away from subsidies, particularly broad subsidies toward general delivery of growth-oriented and poverty-reducing programs like basic education, primary medical care, and public infrastructure, development tax restructuring, expanding the tax structure, and applying reasonable marginal taxation levels, interest rates that are determined by markets, and positive, though moderate in real value. Balanced exchange rates, commerce liberalization, the opening of imports, with specific focus on removing quantitative controls, such as quotas licenses and tariffs, liberalization of incoming foreign direct investment, selling off government-owned businesses, deregulation, and legal protection of private ownership rights, essentially. Put these measures in motion, and you'll end up with an economy. Now, certain policies were simpler to execute than others. Trade liberalization, for instance, began quite slowly among its fellow former Soviet states. But eventually, Russia began exporting its natural resources across the wider globe. It also introduced a new currency in 1992, which it made interchangeable with the old Soviet ruble that existed previously. An amusing little side detail was that the honor-ruble coin, valued under 1 cent at the moment, was nearly the same in size and weight as the 5 Swiss franc piece, which resulted in many Russians hauling bags of those coins to countless Swiss vending machines and purchasing truckloads of snacks that they then brought back home to Russia. I suppose it didn't take them very long to adopt capitalism after all. That's not particularly significant, but it is undeniably amusing. What truly mattered, though, was the issue involving the sale of government-owned corporations. You could imagine considering examples like China that opening to global markets and embracing capitalism was somewhat like a secret formula to ensure economic expansion, at least for the near future. Unfortunately, that didn't quite happen inside Russia, and during the decade after the Soviet Union's collapse, Russia's total GDP actually dropped by over half. The primary explanation for this was the mishandled privatization of the country's business sectors within the Soviet Union. Every industry was managed by the government, but the Washington Consensus encouraged value-producing industries to be transferred privately. There are 2 key motives behind this proposal. The first is that it creates a market-driven economy. You cannot modernize your financial system around capitalism if all of the largest industries in the country remain state-run. The second motive behind this proposal is that it can earn the government a massive sum of money in a very brief period of time. Administrations globally liquidate public assets to release funds, and former communist countries, in theory, possess the most they can sell. Think of that as generating starting capital to begin a new corporate venture, except instead of forming a company, it's building an entire nation. Russia indeed owned many lucrative industries, natural resource production being the most significant, yet there was also telecommunications, energy utilities, and manufacturing. The central issue then became who these industries should belong to. The sensible answer seemed to be whoever paid the most. But there were several difficulties with this. At that period, the top bidders would have been corporations from Western nations, and it was reasonable to believe that the fresh Russian Federation wasn't prepared to accept an American corporation taking control of their oil reserves quite yet. So the majority of these properties were sold domestically. The issue was that citizens, coming out of a collapsed socialist system, generally don't possess the type of money required to make legitimate offers on segments of national infrastructure. The corruption that ensued practically sealed Russia's destiny for the decades ahead. Officials responsible for distributing the country's Enterprises were bribed to assign factories and mines towel-connected figures frequently, including relatives or whoever, provided the most generous payoff. This not only placed essential industries under the ownership of a tiny circle of highly corrupt elites, but it also ensured that the state didn't collect anywhere near as much income as it might have achieved if this privatization plan were managed with greater fairness. These connected figures, or oligarchs, as they eventually became called, not only operated these sectors inefficiently, but they also moved nearly all the profits they earned from their shady ventures and invested those funds overseas. This trend was aided by the Russian government's determination to preserve an elevated exchange rate for foreign currency. Any capital gained inside Russia by the oligarchs could be converted into US dollars or, more frequently, British pounds at a value higher than what open market would typically decide. The Russian state spent enormous sums maintaining this currency rate, but all it truly accomplished was enabling rich and dishonest Russian magnates to purchase apartments and sports clubs in nations they believed were smart investment targets. This outward capital flow caused the government serious difficulty raising revenue and forced it to depend on continuous foreign borrowing. This situation reached its breaking point in 1998 when a disastrous war in Chechnya and the Asian financial meltdown combined to deliver the young Russian Federation its earliest major recession. The state could no longer service its obligations and the exchange rate collapsed rapidly. Poorly run companies failed to appeal to either international or local investors, and firms couldn't even issue wages to their employees, resulting in massive labor unrest throughout the nation. Global investors evacuated the market, further depressing asset valuations and triggering a drain on their reserves held by the Russian Central Bank, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund attempted to step in with a bailout worth $22 billion. These organizations were willing to lend assistance, not only because that was their primary responsibility, but also since no one wanted this financial disaster to steer Russia back toward a Soviet-style socialism. Sadly, and perhaps Tono One's real shock, it was later uncovered that nearly $5 billion of that funding was embezzled by influential bureaucrats immediately after the cash entered Russia. But this steep collapse following a rather underwhelming decade became something of a launchpad for the Russian recovery. Russia's fortune began shifting upward after that downturn for several causes, the first being that there wasn't much farther to sink, but on a more serious level, the currency lost 80% of its worth almost instantly, which was disastrous for the broader economy, yet allowed for debts and overdue salaries to be repaid quite easily. Russia was likewise a major beneficiary of the steady climb in global oil values that persisted through the next decade. It was during this era that one Vladimir Putin would assume the presidency, taking over from Boris Yeltsin, who'd fallen ill and transferred authority to his then-serving prime minister. The incoming leader initiated a series of policies that, to be fair, genuinely improved the economy, but his first official act was implemented on December 31, 1999, and it was named on guarantees for the former leader of the Russian Federation and the members of his household. This decree ensured that any corruption allegations against the departing president and his kin would never be followed up effectively. It served as a presidential amnesty for the ex-leader's corruption case, which conveniently also happened to implicate Putin himself. Yeah, not exactly a promising beginning. Nevertheless, despite ongoing corruption, Russia still prospered considerably through the following decade. Major enterprises became ever more centralized, but that enabled them to stand toe-to-toe with global competitors. The local consumer base was the biggest beneficiary. However, for the first occasion, the Russian population enjoyed access to a financial infrastructure comparable to what people in the West generally consider normal. The citizens were able to access credit, obtain legitimate employment, and use their earnings to sustain authentic enterprises. Within the nation itself, sure, a massive portion of wealth was still unevenly and arguably unjustly concentrated among a very small elite of individuals. But let's be honest with ourselves. It's not like that. doesn't occur inside our own financial systems, right? That's simply part of living in a capitalist economic framework. Well, we'll revisit that later. Russia likewise succeeded in enduring the global recession of 2008, relatively unaffected. Its financial institutions were so young and underdeveloped that they escaped most of the troubles caused by complex financial products. They were, however, temporarily struck by the steep fall in oil prices at that point. Nonetheless, by 2013, strong expansion had returned, and the economy was more than 10 times greater than it had been during the depths of the 1990 downturn. The sitting president was undoubtedly divisive, but at times a faltering country requires decisive leadership to steer it back onto a stable course. The real issue was largely who this newfound prosperity truly benefited, a fact that became especially evident in 2014 with the takeover of crime. Following the startling measures taken by the Russian administration, the United States, the European Union, Australia, Canada, and Japan enacted sanctions targeting Russia. These penalties achieved three main goals. They imposed a prohibition on delivering technology used in oil and gas development. They restricted travel for Russian nationals close to President Putin, meaning the oligarchs, and they banned the extension of credit to Russian oil corporations and government-owned banks. That final one was the critical measure if state banks and energy firms couldn't access capital. They couldn't issue loans, which in principle should deprive the Russian government of the financial means to sustain aggression. In reality, it didn't achieve a great deal. For several explanations, they weren't especially severe and were reversed fairly quickly afterward. Russia was also mostly prepared for these sanctions. Years of exporting oil and gas abroad had allowed Russia to accumulate massive foreign exchange reserves. Nearly all petroleum is traded in U.S. dollars, which meant the Russian state and Russian companies could easily stockpile the world's reserve currency for use in difficult periods. The country did have to spend part of these savings, and the ruble's value did decline in overseas exchanges. But in several respects, this was somewhat beneficial for Russian export-oriented industries, since a weaker home currency made them more competitive within international trade. That's not to imply there were zero negative outcomes. The economy did contract, and the nation experienced elevated inflation rates as imports were prohibited, meaning access to items ranging from groceries to medicine was limited to what could be manufactured domestically. This time was unpleasant for the typical Russian citizen. But the truth is, the policymakers didn't mind Russia as arguably the most unequal nation on earth. And yes, I've claimed that about a few other regions, but here's the truth. We rely on an indicator known as the Gini Index to assess economic inequality. This metric can evaluate income inequality, as in, my employer earns 3 times more than I do, or wealth inequality, as in my employer owns several mansions and drives a car worth more than the flat I share with 4 other financially struggling classmates. In Russia's situation, we will focus on disparities. In wealth, the Gini coefficient places nations along a range from 0 to 1 or 0 to 100 depending on who you consult. 0 indicates total equality, meaning everyone owns the exact same level of wealth, and 100 signifies that all resources in a nation are possessed by one individual while everyone else owns nothing. Based on data from the World Bank, Russia records a wealth Gini of 37.5, which is mediocre, neither good nor awful. It's definitely stronger than the United States, 41.4, and well below South Africa's highest ranking at 63. The difficulty is that these numbers rely solely on the data that the World Bank can actually obtain. The wealthy elite of Russia, including the president himself, have repeatedly been revealed for shifting capital globally in order to conceal and safeguard their genuine fortune. Research from groups such as Credit Suisse has suggested that if this capital were repatriated and included within Russia's accounts, then the nation would easily stand as the single most unequal country worldwide. What this implied was that those with the wealth and influence to shape government policies were not the ones suffering from These restrictions, Russian banks lacking liquidity could simply access their foreign currency, reserves, and divert loans away from ordinary citizens, all while those same citizens struggled to find food and create stability in a collapsing nation in a normal democracy. This would have marked the downfall of the ruling class. But naturally, Russia has never truly functioned as a legitimate democracy in places like Australia or America. Leaders maintain control by keeping the electorate satisfied. Sure, there are campaign contributions, and yes, there are media outlets that can shape these outcomes, but ultimately it still comes down to the voters in nations like Russia. Power is preserved by pleasing the same elites who schemed and paid their way into controlling the country's core industries. This brings us to the Russia of roughly 3 weeks earlier, the state that had accumulated immense wealth by exporting huge amounts of oil and gas to numerous countries dependent on its natural resources. A nation governed by a teeny elite for the advantage of that same teeny elite. A country that possessed a larger foreign reserve arsenal than it did even back in 2014, and a government that faced few real consequences for its previous acts of aggression. The only question now is whether this latest round of sanctions will finally push them to reconsider their choices, something we'll be examining further in next week's episode. But for the moment, we'll place Russia onto the Economics Explained global leaderboard, starting as usual with Scaly. Russia currently maintains a GDP of 1.48 trillion United States dollars. This figure will almost certainly fall sharply in the next few years as restrictions and an expensive war damage their economy's fundamentals. But for now, it remains the 11th largest economy on the planet and earns an 8 out of 10. Russia reports a GDP per person slightly above $10,000. This has fallen notably from its peak of $16,000 in 2013. And for comparison, this number places Putin's nation just behind China, which holds a GDP per capita of $10,500 it receives. 5 out of 10 growth has been underperforming, particularly when compared to the 2000s, when it genuinely seemed like Russia might become a true contemporary economic powerhouse. But graft, misrule, and aggression are hardly ingredients for financial prosperity. And that's evident within an economy that, despite all of its natural resource blessings, has contracted. Throughout the past 10 years, it scores 0 out of 10 stability and confidence. Well, even prior to these recent conflicts, you would only ever choose to operate in Russia if absolutely required. The political risk of an overtly hostile state simply doesn't foster commercial opportunity. And considering the country's behavior during the past fortnight, it's destined to remain a global outcast for many years into the future. 0 out of 10. Finally, industry. Russia possesses vast stores of raw materials and not much else to rely upon. Most companies that succeed domestically aim to relocate as soon as they can to the safer and more business-friendly environments found in Europe and North America. It earns a 3 out of 10. Collectively, this provides Russia with an overall rating of 3.2 out of 10, which places it alongside other notable economic achievements, such as Cyprus and El Salvador.